I'm John Buchanan. Now, it's not often that we start an episode on this channel with a kind of musicological question, but I'm going to ask one. Whose idea was the fade out? When you think about it, we write songs or pieces of music and normally things just end, right? We kind of think, right, that should be the downbeat or that's where a thing should just stop. And yet pop music's history is full of tracks that fade away to silence. Whose idea was that, and why does that kind of work? What is it about the idea of a fade out that is just so endemically built into pop music history? It's an interesting question, and one that I'd like an answer to on a postcard, please. What we're going to do today is to begin to experiment with how we can bring a fade out to our tracks. And of course, there's the straightforward way, which is that we apply a fade out to absolutely everything within our mix so that everything fades out together. And then the slightly more involved way, which is to fade out some things and not others. So before we go any further, let's just have a listen to this track, which I've built for the purpose of making a fade out. We might not listen to all of it because it's 3 repeats of an 8-bar phrase. Sounds like this. And that's enough of that for now. Okay, so if I wanted just to create a fade out for the final 8 bars, how would I do that? I've clearly got 5 tracks within this piece, and yes, I could open up automation data and I could apply an individual fade out to every single track. But that's 5 lots of stuff, and it could be that I've got 64 tracks within my mix. That would take a long time. So instead what I'm going to do is to come to the track menu, and I'm going to come down to Show Output Track. Now what this is actually going to do is to bring the stereo output track, which we can see down in the bottom left hand corner of the inspector, into the mix. So when I release on this, what's going to happen is that I get my stereo output track automatically added to my project, and then if I open up automation, it stands to reason that any volume line I put on this track simply by clicking wherever I want my fade out to start and clicking again to produce an out point will produce a fade out for the entire mix, because of course everything reaches the stereo output. So that sounds like this. Now then, a couple of things to say about this. Firstly, how long do you want your fade out to be? Do you want it to get to that kind of tantalizing point where it's obvious that the next repeat would start if we hadn't faded that out? That's kind of what I've gone for here, and I've just made sure that the volume hits -infinity decibels, which is very quiet, before the next round of repeats would start. Obviously, if I want to, I can make a much shorter fade, and it doesn't matter that my regions last for 8 bars by the time I get down to minimum volume, -infinity. Obviously, the track by then is long gone. But let's just put it back over here for a moment, because there's a couple of other things I can do to my stereo output fade. And the first one of those is to make a non-linear fade. What I'm going to do is to zoom in on this line so we can see it a bit more clearly. And we can certainly now see that obviously this is just a completely straight line that is dropping from 0 dB down to -infinity. But actually, quite often, fade outs sound better when they aren't completely linear. And I'll show you how we can create a non-linear fade. If I press T to open up the toolbar, what I have a chance to do is to choose the automation curve tool. Now there are a couple of things I can do with the curve tool. If I click on the line that I've created and I draw downwards, what I'm effectively going to do is to produce a shape which falls away more quickly to start with and then less quickly towards the end. And what I can also do is to go the other way by effectively creating a ramp that starts more slowly and then falling away more quickly towards the end. Now, Everyone hears fades differently, so you should experiment with what works well for your tracks. But my feeling has always been that a curve that is ever so slightly this shape, so that we begin the fade out a little bit more quickly, but then effectively have it last for longer than you might anticipate, tends to sound a bit more musical. Okay, but again, it's completely up to you. Now, another thing that we can also do with the automation curve tool is to go from creating a linear fade, or indeed one of our non-linear fades, to creating what's referred to as an S-curve. So instead of clicking on this line and pulling down or upwards, what I can do instead is to pull from left to right, effectively just biasing this line either so that we create an S-curve where again volume drops away more quickly, hangs around for a while, then falls off a cliff at the end, or alternatively going the other way so that we create an S-curve that produces a shape more like this. And again, just use your ears. There is no golden. Wouldn't it be great if I could just say, by the way, that's the curve for the perfect fade out? Just doesn't work like that. You're going to have to see what works well for your tracks. But nevertheless, what we've effectively got here is a chance to produce what we refer to as these S-curves by clicking and dragging left and right, as opposed to up and down, which produces our sort of non-linear shapes. Okay, so that covers the idea of an output track fade out. If what I want to do is to create a fade out where everything falls away in volume at the same rate, fine. But what if I don't? What if effectively what I want to do is to create one of those kind of clever fade outs where some of my music disappears and some of it sticks around? Well, of course, there's no way I can do that with a stereo output track because that's going to affect everything. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my stereo output track. I'm going to come to mix, delete automation. And what I want to do is I want to delete the visible automation data on the selected track. The stereo output track is selected. So by deleting the visible data, which is the volume data, we're going to get rid of that automation altogether. And in fact, I can come back to the track menu and I can hide the output track and it's like it never happened. Okay, but what we can do is to take the kind of learnings that we or had a chance to experiment with using the output track to create similar fade outs for the elements that we want to have fade out. And what I'm going to do is to say, yeah, I want the bass to go, and I want the tambourine to go, and I want the drums to go. So I'm going to do that on all three of those tracks. And I think what I'm going to do is to make them all non-linear fades, very roughly following the same sorts of shape. And what that's going to do is to have everything fade out apart from these two tracks within the middle of the mix. And of course, I've managed to leave the stereo output track at -infinity, which is why we can't hear anything. So there's no automation data on this track anymore, but because where I left that fader was at -infinity, that's where it's stuck. So I'm just going to hold down Option and click on that, and we'll get our volume back. Okay, so that's quite nice. That produces this quite ambient end to the piece because we get rid of the kind of driving elements, the bass and the drums disappear, and we're left with the kind of floaty stuff. Now, again, if I was really mixing this piece, I'd probably feel like I wanted that to happen a bit more quickly. I'm going to get rid of the drums and the tambourine by around here, just so we really get a chance to be sure that, well, our ears haven't tricked us. There's just that slight sense with fade outs when you're basically making discrete choices for all of the instruments within your tracks, that you kind of want to make sure that you're not imagining things. And I think by getting away or getting rid of those tracks a little bit sooner might feel a little bit more musical. Let's see. Well, it does, except that I've made a very unmusical choice to kind of make sure that the fade out point is at this really weird kind of fifth bar of this sequence. So again, if I was tidying things up, I think I'd make sure that they were absolutely gone by bar 4, which just feels like it's a little bit more musical in the context of a track that is sort of rhythmical and in 8-bar chunks. So again, that would allow us to create a more discrete set of choices as far as our fade outs were concerned. And now we're beginning to apply fade outs on a per track basis and making some discrete choices about those things. But there's one more thing I want to do as well, which is I do want these synth parts to also fade out, but I kind of want the space and the reverb around them to stick around. How on earth am I going to do that? Well, what I'm actually going to start by doing is coming to these 2 tracks, and what I'm going to make sure that I've got is a reverb that is on both of them. I'm going to open up the mixer for a moment. Let's just close down the automation. I'm going to come into the main mixer, and what I'm going to do is to create a brand new reverb for these 2 tracks. And I'm going to make that auxiliary bus number 3 because it's the first one that is available to me. And just to make this really obvious, what I'm going to do on bus 3 is to come and find, using Space Designer, a nice big plate reverb. I'm going to come into the settings. I'm going to come to the large spaces. Here are some plate reverbs. And look, this one's called Big Plate. What could be more perfect? So there's our Big Plate reverb. And hopefully what we're going to discover if I solo these 2 sounds is because I've turned up the auxiliary sends to the bus over here, the Space Designer bus, is we're going to hear the reverb added to these sounds. There it is. Okay, fantastic. So when I press stop, we can hear that really clearly. Okay, so if I wanted these sounds just to end up in this big space, all I've got to do is to fade out the sounds, right? If I fade the sounds out, then effectively what's going to happen is that the reverb will stick around. Well, no, but let me just show you exactly what happens when we do that. So let's suppose what I wanted to do was to have the final 8 bars fade out, and for the synths to fade out and disappear, but for the reverb to stick around. So if I simply just draw fade outs for these 2 sounds, I don't think we're going to find that that is going to work, because as the sound dies in volume, so the reverb is going to. And the reason for that is because these auxiliaries are by default what we refer to as post-fade. In other words, they come after the fader. So if the fader is falling away in volume, so the send level is also going to drop sort of proportional to, or proportionally, is that the word? Again, another word, another question for the community. But in proportion to the volume that's fading out, so the reverb level is going to drop, because these are referred to as post-fade sends. So in order for the reverb to stick around, what I need to do is to change the relationship between the send dial from that track to the reverb. I need to make it what's referred to as a pre-fader instead, which means that it's going to be independent of the fader. So if I come back to the Firefly synth track and I select this option here, what I have a chance to do is to turn this into a pre-fade auxiliary instead. And I can see that the send swaps around and it now becomes in front of the little tag saying bus 3. In other words, pre. Useful, isn't it? And what I'm then going to do is to come back here again and do the same thing with the other synth. Now, what that basically means is that this send level is now independent of the fader controlling volume, which means that now if I run this section, the original sounds are going to fade out, but the reverb is going to stick around independently. And what's nice about that is that effectively we've now got 3 separate fades happening within our track. We've got the drums and the tambourine and the bass fading away at 1 speed. We've got the synths fading away over a different period of time. And we've got the reverb on those synths doing its own thing altogether. And as a result, if I bring all of these elements back in together, I think the end of this track will now provide quite an interesting sonic little feast. But there's one last thing. Have you spotted it? Yeah, of course. What we want to do is to be able to control the fade, both at the beginning of the track and at the end of the track, of the reverb independently too. Having set up this big plate reverb, these synths now sound completely different because they're now awash with reverb. And at the very end, that sounds great. And up to that point, it sounds like it's too much. So the last thing I need to do is to come over to my Space Designer track. And what I'm going to do is to control click here, and I'm going to create a track for this auxiliary. By doing that, it is added to my project. And of course, immediately, because I've got automation open, volume is the parameter that is selected. And what that means is I can create an automation line completely independently for this synth. Or this reverb, I should say. So what I'm going to do is to start at a really low level. I think I want a little bit of this effect from the beginning. I quite like it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to fade up its volume at the same rate, or more or less over the same area of the track, as the volume is fading out on the synths that are creating it in the first place. And remember, because it's a pre-fader send, this reverb effectively gets to exist completely independently of the levels of those other tracks. Let's have a listen from back here. Nice. Okay, so what we've done within this video is to look at how we can apply output fades to our tracks. If you just want the classic fade out, then what you need to do is to come up to the track menu, come to show output track, and then draw your automation of choice for the new track that will be created at the bottom of your project. And remember, we can create a linear fade, fine, but what we can also do is to use the automation curve tool to create non-linear fades, and also to create S curves so that we're effectively able to shape how volume behaves through the fade out. The moment we need independent fade outs for different parts of our mix, we can use curves on individual tracks. And what we've seen within this project is that effectively what we're in a position to do is to decide how the different elements of our tracks are going to fade out over time. And then what we've done at the end is to create a pre-fade auxiliary, which means that we've got independent volume control of an effects bus. And that's really nice because it means that effectively we can just have our whole mix disappear into this kind of wonderful reverb soup and end up in a kind of really ambient place, which really works nicely on a track like this.